Okay. Good afternoon. This is the Larkspur City Council special meeting to go over the library and library presentation. And my name is Gabe Paulson, serving as Vice Mayor and standing in for Mayor Dan Hilmer. And I wanted to call this meeting to order. Allison, could we have a roll call?
Councilmember Candell.
I am here.
Councilmember Way.
Here.
Vice Mayor Paulson.
Here.
And I do know Mayor Hilmer expects to join us shortly.
Great. So I do not have the agenda in front of me here.
First is a public comment.
Okay, great.
On off agenda items.
Okay, so if we could open the agenda for public comment. Allison, is there anyone in the queue?
I'm looking for any raised hands from our audience members in Zoom or in person. There's no public comment.
Okay, and anybody in the chambers, you said no. So I think we can move on then to the second item, which if you can cue me there, Dan.
Sure, so this is under business item 3.1, discussion about developing the city's parcel at Rose Lane for the new Larkspur Library, options for additional city facilities at the Rose Lane parcel, and future use of the current city hall at 400 Magnolia. And in a moment, I'll turn it over to the Director of Public Works City Engineer, Julian Skinner, who will take us through some PowerPoint slides to help facilitate discussion. But as a precursor, the council was entertaining the discussion that we're starting again today back in November of last year, and essentially and understandably put things on hold to find out whether or not we would receive any sort of funding from the state via the state library grant. We're now, of course, very excited and continue to celebrate the fact that we did receive a grant, a matching grant of $5.2 million. Essentially meaning that we have as a base budget for the new Larkspur Library $10.4 million. So now it's time, November of 21, which is not only the fact that we want to get started on a new library, but with the library vacating this building, we also, because it's quite tied together, we need to figure out what our plan is for this building. And as part of that, we want to talk about any options the council wants to consider with respect to city operations moving with the library. So this is kickoff to this conversation. There's another special meeting scheduled in 2 weeks at the same time. And then additional council discussion at the regular council meetings in November is anticipated. As you're going to hear from Julian, we're on a little bit of a timetable where we need some preliminary decisions made probably by the end of November so that we can kick off some important processes. So with that, Julian, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Julian Skinner, Public Works Director. As a city manager mentioned, I do have some slides here. Yeah, actually, that's all right. Oh. Okay. So we'll start out just a little recap. As the city manager mentioned, it has actually been almost a year since we were before you with this discussion. So we'll just have a little brief presentation on what we were looking at about a year ago, and then we'll give you an update. Again, for those that haven't heard about the recent grant award that we received for the library, and then we'll talk separately about the two paths forward, one for the library and one for City Hall, 400 Magnolia. So the issue with 400 Magnolia is over a year ago, we had a condition assessment done of the building. And the report showed there were some significant issues with this building that had very costly price tags for fixing. And when we started looking at the aggregate of everything that needs to get replaced in this building, you're coming up with a project that's essentially the same cost as building over from scratch. It's a big number. Between 12 and 8 million, between 12 and 18 million dollars is a big variation there, because there's a lot of money in the finishes, and it kind of depends on how you were to finish the building. If it were to be finished as office space, it would be higher to that 18 million. If it was going to be more open space inside, less finishes, then you would be further down near the 12. But you have some big numbers in seismic and life safety, accessibility, things that have to be done regardless of what the building use will be. So that led to our meetings last fall. October and November were before you. And again, we had these two items. One was the library. There was a library call for grant applications out for renovating or rebuilding libraries. And so we got your direction to go ahead and move forward and try and secure some funding to build a new library. And the consensus was that if we got funding, then we should be moving towards a new library at the Commons at the corner of Rose Lane and Doherty. And we also had the conversation about what do we do with 400 Magnolia once the library is not in this building anymore, given there's a big price tag on renovating the building. It seemed a good time to chat about whether we should be looking at a building renovation project, or whether, because the library is moving out, is it also the opportunity to have city offices move out and do something different with the building. And then we basically tabled that conversation and said, let's find out what we're doing with the library first. Let's see how much money we're going to get, what kind of a project that is. And then when we have that path laid out, then we can come back and start talking about 400 Magnolia, knowing that we've got some grant money and we know the library project is going to be moving forward. So as far as the library goes, the city manager mentioned, we did get an award just over $5 million. It's a matching grant, which means that we need to put $5 million of our own dollars towards essentially a $10 million library project. And as you recall, we did also receive a separate $1 million state library grant from Assemblymember Levine. So the other piece of good news is that the Commons Foundation is nearing $5 million in their donations. So now we're looking at a viable project. We have a $5 million notice of grant award, and then $5 million in donations. So we fully intend over the next few city council meetings to be bringing action items before you to start moving ahead with the library project at the Commons. A little bit more detail on that grant. The numbers here show what that's part of that money goes towards. It's not all for construction. It's a complete grant, meaning that it pays for the design of the building. It'll pay for staff time. It'll pay for the project management. So that $10.4 million is the total project budget, including all the staff and consultants and actually building the structure. That is the full grant amount that we asked for. Quite often entities get partial grant amounts when the money is spread among many projects, but we put in for a grant application for 6,845 square foot library, which is the most the grant would allow us. It doesn't allow money for building a bigger library. It basically lets you renovate a library or build something in kind. And so the 6,845 square feet led to that application for a $10.4 million grant. So we got the full grant amount.
Julian, excuse me, do you know, or do we know when the specifics of the grant will be released?
Not unless Franklin has some late breaking news.
No updates? Okay.
Still waiting.
Well, the grant award was 6 months late, so
I know.
maybe the guidelines.
Yeah. Well, they're probably still notifying cities, I would assume, but because I heard there was a second one that's going to be available. So
yeah. So I am going to show some dates, some projected dates moving forward in here. So just keep in mind that as these fine details on the grants, we're going to be limited on what we can commit to until we're for sure that we're going to be spending money in conformance with the grant. So on the one hand, I'm going to be telling you we need to move forward quickly. On the other hand, we're going to want to make sure that we're spending money in conformance with the grant. So we're hopeful to get those rules in short order. So that's the library side of things. And so flipping back over to 400 Magnolia, these are the questions that we're going to come back to you with at the end of this presentation. And that is, should we be looking at this time at putting a second building next to the library on the commons for the functions that are currently operating out of 400 Magnolia, whether that's city offices and council chambers or one or the other. And then the partner question to that is, if those functions leave 400 Magnolia Avenue, then what do we do with this building? So
Julian, can I ask you a quick question?
yes.
As far as the funding goes, if we have a project that includes a library, you're talking about a second building, is that exempt from the funding? Is it possible? I mean, would it make more sense to have one larger building that would all be considered a library? Are we capped at the 6,400 square feet that we're matching? I mean, could you kind of explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so the grant application that we received was very specific, and that it was for the library and it was for the replacement library. So that $10.4 million is earmarked to 6,800 square feet of library space at the Commons. Now, I'm saying second building until we get the rules on the grant. There are still options on what a second building may look like, whether it's attached to the first. Those are things that we're going to work out. There's obvious economies of scale in building two buildings at once on the same site, even if they are not connected. I know there's potentially some programming and some shared space options that could be worked out in the future. We need to make sure in all our paperwork with the grant that we're very definitive on what we're spending that $10.4 million, and it doesn't go outside of what the grant application was for. Now, there is, as we all know, there is some shared space. The library uses this room and our city council, and we have staff meetings in here too. So there is some flexibility, but we could not say go, if we decided we wanted another building, we can't use any part of that 10.4 on another building. It's got to go to that first 6,845 square feet.
So the 6,845, is that this entire building?
No, the 68, there's a slide further on that shows how we arrived at that, but it's basically what we took was if the library was in this building and the city offices weren't, so any place that is the desks of workers or meeting spaces only for staff were excluded. But the library does program in here. The library staff uses the kitchen, uses the bathrooms, uses the hallways. So we were able to capture anything that is library proper or library shared in this building and counted as part of the library. And that's where the 6,845 square feet came from.
Okay. Okay. I'll save my questions. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. This was the matrix that we showed you last year. Again, at this time, we're only focusing on the bottom portion, which is the final makeup of where these functions are to live. At the time, we had talked about, if something goes wrong here at 400 Magnolia, then we have a temporary condition we need to deal with. We still may, but that's not the focus of our conversation tonight. It's how to move the library project forward and what to do with 400 Magnolia. If we have issues with this building, then we may need to jump back up into that first temporary row at some point. And so as you can see here at the time for final, we did have for city offices, 400 Magnolia, the community facilities parcel that we now call the Commons, and then also the option of leasing some other space in the city. For the library, we crossed out all the options other than the Commons for a permanent library. So that's how that shows up. And then we've got the same options for the council chambers as we do for the city offices.
And Julian, do you have an estimate of the square footage for the needs of the office component?
So what we're using right now in just the office space is about 2,500 square feet. That doesn't include hallways or bathrooms or kitchen, because that square footage was all assigned to the library in the grant. But if we were to build a standalone city hall, then you would need some of that shared space back from the library, depending on how the two buildings were going to be situated. So just the actual office space where people physically sit and meet and work is 2,500 square feet.
And I'm sorry, Oh, go ahead.
And that doesn't include your public works department.
It
which is-
doesn't include public works. It doesn't.
It's just this
correct?
area.
Correct. Just what's
Okay.
in 400 Magnolia.
And is that, take into account what's been able to be done remotely during COVID when we've had some staff remote?
No, that number is a pure taking this building and slicing it up as the spaces are designated.
All right.
We have not done a needs assessment moving forward for what should the city hall be. We know it's 2,500 square feet here, but we haven't done. I'll let Dan chime in.
We barely fit in the 2,500 square feet. We currently, because of remote work from some of our employees, we do some flex desk sharing with some of the contractors that we bring inside periodically, and they need a place to sit while they do a report for us or get something done. But we're bursting at the seams now in the 2,500 square feet. We definitely couldn't shrink it.
And have we looked at, I mean, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, the public works building, if there's space, the public works building that we use now, if there's expansion space there?
So I don't think there really is a whole lot. We could probably take away the conference room over there and put 3 more desks. But the other challenge is that's on a lease. You couldn't have any certainty that you'd have that office space.
Oh, right.
Because the district gets its opportunity every so often to decide if it wants to notify us to terminate that lease. And I'm not sure you'd want to situate all your operations.
Okay.
It's also not the most publicly accessible place to.
Sorry, it's just to follow up cost wise. Is there like a estimate dollars per square foot that we can use and assuming it's the same building, not having to do a brand new building?
Right. So I can get into that a little bit on this slide. So this slide talks to the square footage in this building. You see the table there. This building is 9,300 square feet. And this lists out those areas that I spoke of earlier. And there you see that the city offices is the 2,500 square feet part of it. And then you take the numbers that are circled. That's everything that's attributed to the library that gets to 6,845 square feet. And so as we've talked before about maybe locating city staff over on the commons adjacent to a library and how that may look and sizing and everything. We've taken this 2,500 square feet and we've shown a box on here and we've labeled it as 5,000 square feet. I don't think we would go and build something that's the minimum that we're at now. We'd be looking at some flex space. Got to take into account that the council chamber square footage has been accounted for already in the library. So there's a question of if we're going to build city offices, then do we need to make accommodations for council chambers with the city offices or a multi-purpose room? And then you also would need some sort of support. I don't think we would have all the staff going over to the library to using all the bathrooms and things like that. There may be some shared services, but I think for kicking off the conversations today, if we were to look at a city office building next to the library, we're probably going to be talking rough numbers about a 5,000 square foot building.
And I'm sorry, what is the cost for 5,000 square foot building?
So if we use the same analogy that we used for the library and coming up with that cost estimate that gave us the 10.4 million project, that 5,000 square foot building is about an $8 million project.
And I'm sorry, if instead we extended the library building to include an extra 2,500 to 5,000 square feet, is that more economical?
We don't know yet because we haven't got into those discussions with our consultant. We've had conversations. It is definitely less expensive to build something at the same time we build the library with the same contractor. It could be a separate contract or, but to get the economies of scale from the bigger project, that $8 million number I gave you for the 5,000 square foot building or addition to the library, if it were to be one bigger building somehow, that $8 million comes down when you do them together. If we were to build these completely separately, we go and we build a library at 6,800 square feet, and then we open the library and we come back and we build city offices there, that's your $8 million number for the 5,000 square foot city offices. But if we're able to combine them somehow in the process into one project, then that 8 million comes down quite a bit.
Comes down to what? Ballpark.
I wouldn't expect it to be less than 5.
So 5 to 6, we think 5 to 7.
Optimistically, you could maybe get it down to 5, but again, we haven't really looked at what this project's going to look like, and there may be things that lessen the dollar value, but don't allow as flexible construction. So we haven't really weighed those things now. So I don't want people to key in and say, I said we could do it for 5. I'm saying, I know we can't do it for less than 5. I think there's some value to be saved from doing everything at once. But we also need to make sure we do this, project for a building that's going to last at least 50 years, and we set it up so that it's usable for the future, and we're not going to cut corners, and we're going to save money where we can. So it'll be less than 8, more than 5.
And just to make sure I understand, there's not really a savings making it one building containing both of them as opposed to 2 buildings.
Yeah, there may be. We haven't got down into the finer details. There's ways of building 2 buildings and have them act as one building, and how you set up the systems and everything like that with zones, but they only have like one mechanical system, and the same with the electrical. There are ways of doing it, but the most efficient is to have one enclosure. I don't have a dollar value. That's something we could research if there was interest in the cost savings of a bigger building versus 2 separate.
I think when we were first doing this many years ago, we did tour. I can't remember what library we toured, which also had shared office space, and it had glass doors that then closed over, and they locked it and left the library functioning for maybe an evening program or something, but the office area had been locked off. So just the idea that you can actually share that space. Anyway, just thinking of that, one of the ones we toured many years ago.
I think too, just to chime in, if you go back to Julian's slide where he's kind of breaking down the rough cost of the library, you've got about 2.2 million on that slide that are soft costs, aren't related to constructing the building, and that's where you're going to capture a lot of efficiencies, because those numbers don't double because you're building a second structure. So that's the biggest opportunity where you capture savings. Before you move on, Julian, a couple of comments to add in here. When we first brought this to you, it wasn't entirely about, hey, can we go be in a new building too? It's trying to figure out this big price tag that we're looking at for this building, if it's going to be a civic building, and how we would actually do that, how we would accomplish making those repairs. It's a pretty big number when you start to think about it being the office space for 15 to 20 people. The other thing is, if you go take yourself back to the master plan for the community facilities parcel. So the original document sort of kicked us off in all this planning that we've been doing over the years. We did an assessment of meeting spaces in the community, and the deficit was substantial. And I don't think that's changed based on the fact that we can't meet demand with the facilities that we do offer to the public. They're in constant use the minute we make them available. So one of the reasons we also mentioned this is something that council might want to consider, is that it would increase the number of multi-purpose rooms that are available at Rose Lane for these community groups that are looking for these indoor meeting spaces that they don't currently have access to. And then lastly, we won't get into this probably till the next meeting, but we've talked before about the fact that we're never going to have a sole single purpose disaster preparedness, disaster responsiveness location in Larkspur. And so we're really going to need to look at some sort of campus approach. And we've identified Hall Middle School as an important part of that. We've identified the Central Marin Police Authority's building as a key part of that. And this parcel is another opportunity to look at investing in a way that we can continue that campus theme and tell the community, we want you to come to this part of town to get your direction or your resources or whatever it is that that we need to offer depending on the situation that we're dealing with.
I'm sorry, question, this is probably Dan for you. Where are we planning on getting this $5 to $8 million
Coming
from?
soon.
All right. I'll
Talk
hold
about
off
that a
on
little
that.
later.
You know, Dan, in reference to that, PG&E, I believe they're still offering grants for putting in cooling centers and smoke places that people can go to when the wildfires are bad and the power's out. So that might be an opportunity with a new multi-purpose room to have a cooling center.
I think Shannon O'Hare's on the video. I'm not going to make her come on. I saw her on the attendance list though, and I've been forcing her to put that application together.
Good.
I'm cautiously optimistic we might get some money. It's not going to be enough money from PG&E to actually do everything we would need to do. That's actually one of the items that we envisioned if we're fortunate enough to receive an influx of revenue from Measure G. It was an investment in Hall Middle School.
Yeah.
Let's see more of the presentation.
Okay, so this is a slide I've shown before and it's just been updated, and I'll say the same caveat as before. I am not an architect, so this is not what the final product will look like. This is generally just to show folks the size of the buildings and how they relate to the site, how much of the space they would use up. And in general, we've been talking about the library being near the intersection of Rose and Doherty, and then the parking lot being accessed further back off of Rose. So that's what's displayed on this slide. These are from an architect. So this is the Commons group put these sketches together. This is what they used for their fundraising. And so we'll be working with documents like this when we move forward through an RFP and an RFQ to get a design build team on board. So little similar in layout with the building at the intersection of Rose and Doherty and the parking in behind. And they had some other renderings too. This was their idea of what the inside of the building would look like. And then a future phase shown there on the next one. So the other thing that we have chatted a little bit about is the access to the building. And this is something preliminarily that we had a traffic consultant draw up. There are significant concerns about having more access on Doherty Drive. There's a 10-foot wide sidewalk there for a reason on Doherty. It was part of a class 1 bike path for all the school kids that ride their bikes on the sidewalks. And so we need to be mindful of cutting more driveways into it. And also with the 2-way left turn lane there, it's very complicated to make side access off of Doherty. It's far better to bring folks in through the traffic signal at Doherty, then people can make their left turns at a traffic signal and bring them into kind of a little bit further back than the midpoint of the site here. And then we're also showing that little parcel on the right as you were to drive in on Rose that we could develop for parking. We've discussed this before as maybe working for staff parking because it's not right next to the building. And then we're showing a few other things here that are kind of concept at the moment, but you know, we have heard from the folks in Rose Lane that they're a little concerned about the streets being used for access. And so what we're showing here is that some sort of an entryway treatment. We're showing a traffic circle here. It doesn't necessarily have to be there, but we want to make something here that cues folks to the fact that this is where you turn into the library and that don't go any further than here unless you're going into the subdivision. So that's what our traffic engineer drew up as a concept for what would be the main access into the site. So what we're planning on doing now with the library is with the grant money and the foundation money, we'll be coming forward to you with an item to add this money into our capital budget so that we can start working on things, hiring consultants and getting documents out there. So this is the way we account for the money. We'll set up a capital project in our CIP. It will get assigned a number, and then all the grant funding and all of the donation funding will get funneled through that project. So we can say that it went to, we can show that it went to this project. So that's a step that needs to occur. We also need to get a project manager, a construction manager on board to help us with this process. I mentioned before, we use Kitchell for some of the preliminary work. They've done projects just like this all throughout Northern California, and they were able to help us a year or so ago when we first looked at this. They would need a new contract to help us move forward with this process. And it starts with getting an RFQ out there, which is a request for qualifications for design build team, and then a request for proposals from those teams, and then moving forward from there. And basically with a company like Kitchell, they're there to help us out in the beginning. They're there the whole way through the project, all the way to when we're commissioning and making sure all the windows and doors open and close properly as they should, and signing off on the building and making sure all the warranties and everything are in place. They have different folks that do all those tasks, but they have a well-rounded team that helps throughout that process.
What was the name? Kitchell?
Kitchell, yes.
Okay.
Some of you may know we do have a history working with them in Larkspur before. I believe they worked on the Central Marin police building some years ago. And then, as I mentioned, with Kitchell's help, we'll be looking to develop an RFP for design build. We still need to see the final grant rules, but per the California public contract code, you are allowed as a public agency to do a design build project. And this is different from our typical engineering projects where we hire somebody to design a project and then we put it out to bid. And then we get bids from contractors and we take the lower bid. What we're looking at for this project, because we have a tight timeline with the grants, and because we have an uncertainty with how long we're going to be able to use this building for, and thirdly, we have a fixed dollar amount. We believe that a fixed contract using an RFP for a design bid build gives us the best opportunity. So basically what that looks like is we draft up, say, the preliminary engineering drawings, preliminary architectural plans, and we send notice out to companies that do design build contracts. So this is typically an architect and his or her team, meaning all their engineers, and a contractor that team up to deliver a project. They both design it and then they build it. We would give them the parameters of what we want in an RFQ. They would come back with their qualifications, tell us what they've done that's like this and how great of a job they're going to do for us. We look through those statements and then we pick a handful that we think are really good, and we have them come in and we interview, and that's the RFP process. That's where they show us what they're going to give us for the 10.4 million. Now, again, they've got to give us a 6,845 square foot library for 10.4 million. That's a given per the grant, but it's going to be that level of finishes. How fast can they do it? How well will they work with the city? All of those things that we would look for in picking somebody out of that design build process. So I'll talk a little bit about timing, again, with the caveat that we don't have the final grant rules in hand, but assuming we do in short order, you're looking at the number of tasks here. The criteria architecture is that base design that we're looking for that's going to set how many offices do we need, how much flex space, bathrooms, all of that stuff, programming the building so that when we do get the RFP, we know what we're getting and we're comparing apples to apples. You've got that first request for qualifications that we're aiming to get out before the end of the calendar year. So that's out on the street for all design build entities to see and to fill out the questionnaires, let us know what they can do for our project. Followed up by the RFP. A few months after that is after we've selected the design build teams, then we issue an RFP where we get more specific what they're going to do for us. And then we come back and would come to council to award that contract. And we're tentatively looking at middle of next year to get through all of this front end stuff. And then at that time, once we've awarded that, then the contractor hits the road and does all the final design to get all their building permit plans in space. And then once they have their building permit, then they start the construction. So you're looking at about 8 months of design work. Again, we will have done a lot of the preliminary design ourselves in developing that RFP. So that takes some of the time off the design work. And then the construction I have here at about 1 year and 4 months. It could be as quick as a year, but it always kind of depends on weather and materials availability. And so that puts you with opening the doors on a new library. And I think I've got September of 25. That's kind of the long range time frame we're looking for. We don't have the must use funds by date for the grant yet. When the application went out, I believe it was March of 26. So we know we're good with that first date that was published. It may get extended because it took an extra 6 months to get the grants awarded versus what we first understood. But this is looking at delivering a project within the funding constraints time-wise that we know of today.
So I want to remind the council, we've been really fortunate in Larkspur that weather's been cooperative with us when we built things. And so our timetables have been pretty accurate, but we should always be prepared for slippage, right? Because we could have the most torrential downpour in history during this construction window that Julian's showing, which for other reasons we might want to have. But I bring that up because there's not a lot of slippage to March of 26. So what that means is that front end before the gray, before the construction, we don't have a lot of time to spend here. And that's why you've heard me say before, if we get this grant, it's pedal to the metal time. There's not a lot of, we can't really slow down. We've got to start doing all this work now. And that's why we want to have a couple kickoff conversations with you. So you're starting to think about these things before we start bringing you the items that you have to make decisions on. I'll turn back to Julian. I know he has some more.
Julian, I have a sort of a timeline question. The Commons, the Friends of the Library, and the Larkspur Library Foundation, the three of them have been really passionately working on this public-private partnership. And now with the grant, it's an extraordinary opportunity. If they continue to fundraise, and they are continuing, because there's always going to be costs. Let's say they continue to fundraise and are very successfully fundraising in the next 6 months. How does that change our dollar amount for going out for bid, or does that?
So you mean if there's more money in the
Yes,
budget?
if there's more money in the pot.
So there are things that were not included in the grant application because they weren't eligible, such as furniture. And I'm sure our library director can tell you how expensive flexible, movable library shelves and furniture is going to be. So there's a list of other items. There's some landscaping in the project, but basically the outdoor courtyard space and some flex space that we had talked about before, that's not included in the budget. So there's additional stuff outside of that square footage that could be attributed to the library. And then as you get to a certain point, then you could start to talk about additional square footage. And then we would have to have the conversation about which building should it be in, should it be part of the city. But these are, when you look at these dates here, these uncertainties up front, you know, if there's going to be additional funding, if we're going to build a city hall, if those decisions drag on, then these red bars are going to drag on also.
But I think one point with the question you asked Councilmember Way is, if we're going to take advantage of the value that we think we can realize with a design build approach, where we tell the design community, we have X number of dollars, what will you build us? When we publish that document, that's the amount for the base project. So we can't come back, because basically we have to start the process over if we come back and we want to say, oh, we changed our minds, now we have even more money. But to Julian's point, there's going to be a number of opportunities to enhance the Commons as a place that aren't part of that initial design build project.
Just last thing, in that we've done so much in iteration one of this, a lot of those concepts of having like the children's reading room and the children's garden, and how much of sort of the work that's already been done in this RFP? I mean,
I don't think we will actually capture a lot of the base work that goes in the RFP or the RFQ.
Yeah.
Because what we essentially now need to do is sit down with, if we bring Kitchell on or whomever we bring on, we need to sketch out what 6,845 square feet looks like. And with the open library concept that we've been promoting now for the last few years, which wasn't part of the last planning process. What we won't lose that's still of great value in the previous planning processes, we paid for analysis of wind currents, and we paid for analysis of where does the building need to be situated so we can use solar. Those types of studies don't need to be repeated. You know, probably somebody just has to double check the world hasn't changed significantly on any of those variables. But the initial preliminary design, we're kind of back. But again, we're now talking about a totally different process. We're talking about doing design build. So you're commissioning a team to come up with that technical design and come up with the build proposal all at once.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. 'Cause I just know the fundraising is heating up again because of the excitement of having the grant and actually seeing that we're going to get this done.
Okay, so that was the end of the library content of the presentation. I think the message there is there's lots of things that are going to be happening. There's going to be items coming to you, as the city manager mentioned, throughout the meetings in November to kick off some of these processes on the library side of things. And so now I'm going to switch it back to this building. And the question of whether, as we're building a library at the Commons, should we also consider a second building, whether it's for city offices or city offices and flex space, council chambers. And then also, as we're looking at the site for the library and we decide not to do that, we should probably take into account that we may come back and do that at some point, or the library may expand. Just kind of lock in where that library should be, as I showed on that slide, my cartoon. And then the question about this building. So with the library moving out, if we do decide to locate City Hall, council chambers somewhere else, then what happens to this building? What would you like to see? What wouldn't you like to see? What's off the table? Kind of that conversation getting kicked off again. And so I think that's the end of my slides, and I'll turn it over to the city manager for the dollars part of it.
Yeah, and then we'll turn it for general discussion. So you asked, where would some of this money come from if we actually want to do a second building and add to the budget? And we brought you some numbers back in November. Now we've had a chance to really look more closely at what our options are. And there's 5 sources of money that I see as readily available in terms of discussion. Each one of these sources has a pros and cons tied to it. So this isn't for you to decide today. I would bring you a full analysis of the pros and cons of each of these pots of money, but I thought I'd talk generally about them so you had a sense whether this was even realistic to talk about. So you have 2 unrestricted sources, meaning these are well within your discretion for you to decide that you want to apply them without having to really think hard about policy questions, just zero-sum questions of where else would you have spent the money. So the first is the general fund reserve. You'll recall we boosted up the general fund reserve to manage the Bon Air Bridge project. So we know that once Julian brings you his brilliant mitigation projects and gets them all done, and we enjoy all those new things like our new dog park, we have some liquidity in our reserve that we didn't necessarily have before. We do want to use our reserve to address some other liabilities that the city has. Most notably, we still need to deal with our OPEB, our retiring medical challenge. But that said, I think even doing that, we still have about $1 to $2 million in general fund reserve capacity that you could contribute to this project. This is money we had slated away for capital improvements. And so the question is, that you'll have to wrestle with at a future meeting is this where you want that capital improvement money to go versus another project? The other thing is we're coming to a conclusion on the Measure B road rehabilitation project. That program is evolving from rehabilitation into maintenance. Maintenance is supposed to come out of the various road funds that we get, and then out of the Measure B tax revenue itself if necessary. These are the bonds that you used to do the rehabilitation project. Well, Julian's still wrapping up, but I think we're going to end up with $1 million to $1.5 million of unused bond capacity. And this is cheap money. We got a really good interest rate. We could not go get this interest rate again in the current conditions. So according to Bond Council, any public project, any public infrastructure is eligible for these bonds. So you could decide that you want to put them into this project. So those are your two kind of unrestricted sources that you have. And then you have some that you've restricted by policy. So you'd have to decide if you wanted to maybe rethink some of your policy, although I'm going to give you some arguments for why they fit your policy as well. So the Measure C fund, the Measure B fund, and the TOT fund are all what I want to discuss. Can you click through one more slide? Thanks. So the Measure C fund still has a balance. So this was the sales tax measure that passed in 2013. And you might say, well, why in the world does it still have a balance? One was we were holding a small amount in reserve. The other thing is, to our amazement and surprise, the antiquated way that the state processes sales tax meant even last year, we were still getting reimbursed for Measure C money that we should have actually gotten like 5 years ago. It just takes the state so long to keep sending it to us. So Kathy Orm, your administrative services director, tells me she thinks they may be pretty close to done. If she gets any more Measure C checks, it's going to be a pittance. But you have a balance in that fund of roughly $700,000. Your committee, your Citizens Oversight Committee, had strongly encouraged you to hold that, particularly for investment in fire stations. But that recommendation was right around the time we were transitioning everything into the Central Marin Fire Authority. And I think now what we do at the fire stations is a more complicated conversation that involves our partnership with Corte Madera. So you might consider moving that money. The other pot you might want to talk about is the Measure B fund. As the council knows, the Measure B revenues have been much higher than we ever projected. And we were very conservative on purpose, so that way when we went out for bonds, we would always be able to make the payments. Well, we've outperformed our projections by $500,000 or more every year. So I don't expect that to continue. We're starting to see some flattening out, but we built up a healthy reserve. And even after your recently adopted reserve policy for Measure B, I think there's roughly 1.4 million that could be made available. My policy argument for that we're not talking about necessarily or arguing about today, but we'll have to engage, you will have to engage each other in the community to think about is, going back to that discussion about this being part of our disaster preparedness and responsiveness hub, I think is a strong argument for potentially investing these monies, because we always told the community these tax measures, one of the things we'd be doing with them is disaster preparedness. We heavily are emphasizing it in our current conversation with the community, but you can go back and look, and we talked about it having context in Measure B and in Measure C. And then lastly, we've had a lot of discussion over the years, could the parking that's created at this lot serve as overflow to the downtown? And I think the answer is yes, for those of us who are willing to walk a few blocks. I know not everybody's excited about walking a few blocks, but for those that are, and so I think there's an argument that the balance in the TOT, which has got a pretty healthy reserve, about $500,000, and you've slated for the investment in the community in ways that it help the business community. I think creating overflow parking for the downtown is a reasonable argument to invest that money. You'll recall this is money we actually had thought we might have to spend to survive the pandemic, and because we did better in the pandemic than we expected, we still have that money available to us. So what this means is we probably, if you decide this is a route you want to go to, we probably can free up in cash alone close to $5 million. Which gets us pretty close to the number. And then we'd have to figure out a way to finance the balance.
The mayor, and you're hoping, we're not going to make that decision tonight, but you've laid this out.
Just to give you food for thought. These are all coming to you as discussions. This is like future discussions.
Right. Are you anticipating that before the RFQ, I get Q's and P's mixed up, before that goes out in the beginning of next year, we will have finalized this?
You have to tell us, ideally before the RFQ goes out, if we want to pursue the second building, because we need to then tell we need to write that into the RFQ.
Okay.
So the RFQ is document one. You go out and you say to folks, are you qualified and interested?
Right.
And what they typically do is they respond in a very general sense, and they tell you who their team would be, who the design person would be, who the construction person would be. There actually would be commonalities. A lot of them will all tap the same members of the subcontract world. What Julian was referencing is then you pick from the RFQ, you pick the handful that you think are the best. You say, come do the full-blown presentation for us. We're going to get in the weeds with you. So.
Dan, when you say the second building, that also includes everything as one in one building.
Yeah, I've been calling it second building. It could be one building. I do have to say, I am less optimistic than probably Julian is that one building is an option. I think my experience with state auditors is they are gonna hate that. And I think in all likelihood, it's two structures. Now, I'm hoping we could connect them with a nice hallway and that would be fine, right? Or something. But I think to make sure no state auditor has heartburn over our project, that 68-45 structure is a structure. It probably is our cleanest way to comply.
We can make a breezeway.
A breezeway. I'm hoping it could just be a really nice big hallway. I think if I've learned enough from doing library planning, Franklin can laugh at me if I get this wrong, but I think librarians call it a boulevard, and then they put all these books out there. See, he's nodding. I nailed it. All right. So that's probably my dream scenario, because I know I've seen enough libraries now that I understand their design. That's probably an ideal thing for the community. But
okay, how shall we take this?
it's an open-ended preliminary conversation, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Shall we? Do you have questions?
Yeah, actually, I've been campaigning and door walking in neighborhoods.
Well, this is
in
for
the last-
questions about the.
I know, and a lot of couple of questions have come up that not just in Rose Lane, but in other areas, questioning noise and what possible impact can be here. And I think it's really clear that we have had this conversation about this not being an active recreation site where there's going to be outdoor courts and places where there's going to be noisy activity like that.
Wait. We want to give ourselves a chance to have a conversation about planning. I'm not interested in hemming in the council with statements right now. When we
All
hear
right.
from the public.
All right. I just think that's
let's keep it open.
All right. Then we'll hold off on that.
Well,
We may need to schedule weddings, memorials. We may need to do things
Well.
outside.
Well,
The pandemic has changed things.
Mr. Mayor, I am gonna reiterate though, I would be stunned if we would exempt ourselves from our own noise ordinance.
Right.
And there is a noise ordinance, and whatever we choose to do with the property, we would want to be the same good stewards that we ask of the rest of the community. So in that respect, that would be my response to a community member is we're not gonna exempt ourselves from our own law.
Right. I just think that the active recreation is a concern that some people have, and we've decided that active recreation isn't going to happen there with basketball courts and things like that. So
I do think I will support the mayor though. These terms don't necessarily mean the same thing to everybody. That's always been my challenge of what I think is active recreation and what someone else thinks is active recreation. I've been surprised. We don't always agree. We all agree basketball is probably an active recreation. We've all agreed a swimming pool is active recreation. I've had people tell me bocce courts are active recreation, but then I've had other people tell me, no, that's super quiet. It's passive recreation.
all right.
Mr. Mayor, I had a question, Gabe here.
Hi, Gabe. Yes, please.
Yeah. Hey, I'm curious about discussing a little more the expanded uses of the facility, particularly for disaster preparedness or planning. And I don't know if the city manager or public works director know of any unmet needs, like are there not enough charging stations, or is there simply room capacity, or what might we be looking at to make this double up as a sort of disaster preparedness facility?
Well, the networks, for one. Go ahead, Mr. City Manager.
I think if we're in the very early stages, but I think if we realize the vision at staff that's starting to formulate, you have this sort of three spots. You have the Central Marin Police Authority, which would probably serve as a command center where, for example, an energy captain would go down to get the latest instruction they might need or guidance or assistance. You've got Hall Middle School Gym, which if we can invest in it in our partnership with the school district, I think is actually one of the places we'd want people to go if they needed cooling or power or something like that. So we'd like to make an investment there. But the third part is we don't really have a good spot for whether it's additional communications and command area, whether it's resource distribution. We don't really have that where we could tell people to go and we'd say we're set up to actually do that. So I think we'd want to look at this facility as an opportunity to do that sort of thing. The other thing that we have to be aware of is we want to make sure wherever we're sending people into disaster is resilient and seismically sound, for example, and we would expect this building would be, so that would make it a big advantage, as would the other two. And then again, just from a planning standpoint, the lack of meeting spaces to be able to address that to some degree has its own value, even in disaster preparedness. One of the groups that's constantly asking us for meeting space is our disaster preparedness community. So.
Other questions from the council before we take public comment? Scott.
Yeah. I'm not sure who to address this to, so Dan, perhaps you. If we were interested in increasing the fundraising and we wanted to offer certain things, we're going to name a room after somebody with this donation level, or, you know, they sell bricks outside where people make donations and they get their name as, you know, somebody who helped do that. When do we have that conversation? Because you know, if we're going to do RFQs and we want to kind of have a final number of the amount of money that we have to do this, it seems like we would want to do those things relatively soon. Do you have experience with that, and how does that normally work?
Well, I think that part of that is having a very candid conversation with the Commons Foundation. We haven't actually talked to them about the expectations of any of the donors they've already realized in terms of names. And I know that the council several years ago had sort of given tacit approval to the Commons Foundation to have some of those conversations, recognizing ultimately the council needs to improve those decisions. I have only personally been involved in one discussion for this new facility that came up recently, and I was involved because there's some synergy to a city operation. And so we were trying to help bring that donor some peace of mind that a city operation would be addressed in the new building. And so it's probably getting to be about time for having that sort of conversation, but I think hearing from them eventually about what their expectations are, what their donors' expectations are, is part of it as well. And then I also don't want to, not only do I want to underscore what Julian said about the fact that we still need to figure out how to furnish the building, which we will, but it'd be great if donors want to help with that, because and that's actually a great way to sell some naming rights. There's also the long-term fiscal health of running a library, and there is an opportunity with our 3 support groups for them to come together for the future and combine forces in a way that would endow the operations of the library long-term. That is something the Larkspur Library Foundation has been doing for us on a modest scale when you look at some of the other communities around us. And so I think capturing that energy and saying, let's do what these other communities are doing to really enhance our experience at the Commons going forward is a big opportunity that shouldn't be missed here.
Great. If there are no other council questions, I'd like to hear from members of the public who may be attending. Are there folks in the chambers? If you'd like to make a comment, please come up to the microphone and state your name and where you live.
Street. I like so much of what I'm hearing. I'm really excited about the library and the community use there, but I'm concerned about abandoning this building. I don't know if I'm misinterpreting what I'm hearing, but I'm hearing a lot of talk about a new city hall over there and a community campus, a civic campus there. But I think one of the things that is really special about Larkspur is our sense of our history. And I think that it's worth a lot, and it might be more expensive to retrofit this building and to keep it serving, the needs of the city government and tangential purposes. It might be a lot more expensive to do that here on this site than it would be over there, but it would be worth a lot more too, I think, or it might be. I think that's something that the previous citizen committees, the 2050 committee probably gave a lot of thought to, and I don't remember offhand exactly what they concluded, but I'm pretty sure it's not abandon this building. I think they probably felt pretty strongly about, making this building suitable for another 100 years. Thanks.
Thank you for your comments. Are there other members of the public here with us today? Hi.
Hi, good afternoon. Ann Morrison, 198 Harvard Drive. What an exciting time. It's finally happening. So it's going to make Larkspur the perfect little city in Marin County. I just want to say thank you for mentioning the noise ordinance. There is a rumor going around that it's going to become a music venue at one time. So thank you for clearing that up. Julian, great update. Thank you. Can you go back just to the Hospital Rose Lane draft for the reconfiguration? I just didn't follow how cars are going to go in and out. I mean, I know it's just a draft. Number 12, page 12. Please. Slide 12. How is that going to happen?
Right. So it's a little difficult to tell on this, mainly because the in lane that you would use from the street is right on top of where the sidewalk is now. And so as you'll look here at Rose Lane, you see two arrows, one turning left and one going straight.
Yes.
Those are two exit lanes from the subdivision. So the left turners would have their own lane. Well, on the just below that left turn is where the sidewalk is now. That would become the through lane into the subdivision and into the commons parcel. It doesn't show up very well here because everything's gray. And like I said, there's a sidewalk underneath it, but essentially you would add a lane to Rose Lane where the sidewalk is now on the west side. That would become the in lane. And then the two lanes that are there now would both become out lanes.
But why do you need a roundabout?
You don't necessarily need a roundabout, but what the proposal was here is that you need an entryway into the site. And typically what you try to do is commingle your entrances and driveways into one focal point to make an entrance. So even though the driveway to the Lucky Shopping Center is not being used at the moment, there's a physical driveway there. And so if you were to locate a driveway anywhere on Rose Lane, the first place you would look to try and do it is opposite of that driveway. It lets you line your sidewalks up and your crosswalks and everything. So you have one intersection rather than two intersections.
Okay, I know it's a draft. I just needed to be clarified. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, for being here.
Yes.
And what's great about that is that then diverts traffic from going into the residential area. If people are just coming into the library or just dropping off someone, they won't be entering into the rest of the residential area. I think that's very creative.
Thank you. Other members of the public here in the chambers before we look online. Yes, sir. Welcome, Dennis.
Dan, council members, Dennis Gilardi, 250 Hawthorne Avenue. First is a question in regards to Julian, your presentation about the parcel, which is what, 2.5 acres-ish? What percentage of that would be taken up in the buildings that you showed on your slides?
Gonna make me do math on the fly here. So
no, I mean, half, a third. I don't need.
No, it's roughly. So if it's 2.5 acres, it's about 100,000 square feet. And so you're looking roughly at about 12,000 square feet plus that again for the parking. So 20 to 25% parking and building.
So it means there's still a lot of room left there in that project.
Yes.
Yes. And then it gets to the second point. Dan talked about pots of money that could be used from leftovers for emergency preparedness and other needs in the community. What you need to get on the table right now is the fact that the emergency preparedness and providing services to the community has got to be centered on Central Marin Fire and the police station. And you cannot avoid the discussion of what to do with our fire stations. There are currently 4 fire stations in the new Central Marin. 3 are being used to house firemen, 1 is not. And it's a given that of at least 2, if not 3 of them, are failing buildings, old buildings, and can't be used in the future or shouldn't be used for fire stations. So this is a prime location where if we're thinking, and it's part of my burden, is I can think and look at things way out in the future, how they should be at the end of the tunnel. The Commons property is at the foot of the Ross Valley. The Ross Valley is serviced by numerous fire agencies, and Larkspur and Corte Madera led the way in the last 25 years of joint sharing of services. We've got the Central Marin Police with 3 communities. We have the fire, which has got 2, but they're also joined at the hip with Kentfield from a service standpoint. So our fire service is seamless between Larkspur, Kentfield, and Corte Madera. You have a prime example this last week. Southern Marin, after 2 years of study, is coming together and going to form 1 fire district. For 40 years, we've had 1 paramedic district that has been very successful. It worked. When that was formed, we had 8 jurisdictions, 8 fire departments, 8 fire chiefs. And over the last 40 years, that's been shrunk to fewer than 8. And with the fact that Ross Valley Fire, the town of Ross, and all the rest of that is under tremendous change right now for fire service, we should be thinking, and I would suggest you as the leaders of this town should be thinking about what we're going to, where we're going to be and how we can contribute. We've done it with police. We've done a little bit with fire. And I don't think you can set aside the land use side of that property or say that we can take TOT money, leftover C money, or this other money and use it for fire, for emergency services without including Central Marin Fire and the fact that they should be the leader in providing the services. Thank you.
Thank you. Allison, do we have members of the public that are online who would like to make comments or ask questions?
We do have audience members from the public, and I'm looking for any raised hands. Our first comment will come from Dawn Matheson.
Hi, I'm sorry I had to duck out of the meeting a little bit for another meeting, but I wrote down some notes that I just wanted to discuss or to have like kept in mind as something that the public would be interested in. My question is, and I know you guys aren't to this is down the road, but one of the things that as a member of the public that I would like to see in the plans and the reports is the assessed anticipated maintenance of any plans that you come up with, just because there can be a real big difference in the materials that you pick on what the anticipated maintenance is. And some of the preliminary designs, you know, the pie in the sky designs I've seen illustrated to me pose maintenance problems. And if this is a 50-year building, that's something that you really want to take into account when you're thinking about cost, you know, over long-term cost. The other thing to keep in mind is the experience of the designer. I want to bring to mind for the council the experience that College of Marin is having with their current new art building that they built. I'm not sure what the status of it is now, but they sued the architect. And the art building is really just kind of a ripoff. I'm here at UCLA with my son, and it's kind of a ripoff of the UCLA art building. So it actually should be better rather than have problems. So those are two things as a member of the public that I'd like to see kind of written up in the report when you come up with the design. And then the last comment that I have is I'm wondering, because of the location, if there couldn't be an economy made with combining with the school libraries, because you're surrounded by 4 public schools in the Larkspur district. And I was wondering if you could bring in those libraries, those librarians, to kind of comment on how there could be a symbiotic relationship, at least between the public library, since it's situated right in the middle of Hall, Tamascool, Redwood, and San Andreas. In fact, it's right next door to Tamascow. It seems like it's a great opportunity for there to be a symbiosis there, and maybe they could actually provide more with less. So those are my comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your comments.
Donna, this is
Allison,
Catherine. I want you to know that our Franklin Escobedo, who's our librarian, is in the audience, and he's rapidly shaking his head. And I think he's very interested in that kind of collaborative approach too. I'm not taking words out of your mouth, but I know we've talked about this before. That collaboration is going to be really important.
Hi, are there other members of the public that would like to ask questions or make comments?
The next comment will come from Julie Electa.
Thank you, Allison. Good afternoon, council members. I submitted a letter earlier, so I won't repeat myself. You have that information. I have been in and out of this meeting, and one of the in times I saw the proposed, the rough layout of how you would do the entrance and exit and the roundabout. And I just wanted to say that I think the roundabout, from my perspective as a Terraces resident, is a great idea because it is both a visual and an intuitive traffic director that will help traffic flow to where it wants to go, the library and the city administrative offices, and will be a good way to make sure people don't inadvertently end up in the interior of the subdivision. That's all I have to say on this. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Allison, who's next?
I'm looking for any additional raised hands from our audience members. We'll hear from Joe Jennings next.
Hi, Joe.
Good afternoon, Dan and council. I had a clarifying question. I'm Joe Jennings from the Commons Foundation. Dan Schwartz, the time schedule you gave, when do you have to lock on how much money you have for the building? Is it the December date or the March date in the coming months?
I saw Julian, but I think December, and he's going to nod his head, right?
Yeah, ideally to not affect the schedule at all, it's the December date. If you start pushing out to the March date, then that March date now becomes an April, May date. So if you don't hit the December for the point of when you lock everything in, then your dates start to slip, and it kind of depends on what things you change and how far out it pushes the schedule.
Right. And so just to reassure people, I think the Commons Foundation is confident that we will be at or near the $5 million mark by December 31st of this year.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Yeah,
We'll look forward to updates. Allison, who's the next public comment to be made?
I am looking for any additional raised hands. There does not appear to be any further public comment.
Thank you very much. We'll close public comment and bring this back to the city council for any further discussion. Dan Schwartz, are there any further comments to be made about overall this building or overall considerations in our kind of campus planning?
Well, we focused a lot today to stimulate your thoughts going into our next special meeting on the key decisions about what would happen at the Commons property. We didn't spend a lot of time today, and at our next meeting, we'll spend more time, which is sort of what would happen to this building. And you'll recall from your November conversation about this last year, it's kind of a planner's dream in a sense, right? You can sort of sit down and say, well, what are the opportunities? There are potentially other civic uses for this building, ones that may or may not require the same level of investment that Julian's team has identified if we're going to make this a safe, relatively modern city hall, one that's accessible, which is a big challenge. So that's one option. Another option is to possibly find out if there's a nonprofit entity, or if you wanted to put out to the development community, and I want to say it's not to abandon, it's to repurpose. So, you could go out to the development community and say, knowing that you have to retain the facade of this building, what might you do with it? And just see what people say. You'll recall that we did that actually with the Rose Lane property, doing our due diligence. We asked the development community, if we asked you to build a library, but we let you build housing, what does that look like? And we ultimately decided that wasn't the right fit, but we went through the exercise, and I for one can say I had not envisioned some of the ideas that we got back. And I hope that everyone on our staff, and we've been brainstorming, we have our own pet thoughts about cool things for this building, but we're not developers. We're not sure what they would come up with, and so it might be interesting down the road to find out.
Well, could I just throw something out there? And I have the good fortune of having been around listening to different city managers, different public works directors, different librarians over my time here. And I had the good fortune of having a contact with Hamid Shamsapur, a public works director that was here before Julian, before Mary Grace. And he had proposed at one point, and I talked to him about it actually this morning, we exchanged messages. He had proposed a bridge between this building and the fire station, making one office level out of this building and the building in the adjacent building, or in the second floor of the adjacent building, one level usable area. And I was listening to Mr. Gilardi today talk about his observations regarding public uses. I thought, might we look at bringing those two things together just as one of the alternatives to see, say, if Central Marin could maybe use this the second level of two buildings, maybe community room downstairs, used just in many of the ways it is used now. And actually talking to Mr. Gilardi about one of his pet projects, which would be a volunteer fire museum in the adjacent building. That seems like one alternative we ought to frame, at least for the sake of conversation. And it all came out of today, listening today. So I think that's helpful. Thanks for the public comment.
Certainly the timing of that idea is a good one, because I think the Central Marin Fire Authority Council is going to start to receive reports from staff about the conditions of the firehouses, including the one next door, and their suitability. We're actually hoping to refine and complete a study that we commissioned. So it's all timely.
I mean, it sounds like that's one winning option. I also want to comment on what we heard from the speaker about putting additional public safety uses on the community facility parcel. I for one, would not want to limit future expansion as much as we could there, given the conversation we're having now. So I appreciate those remarks, but I think the constructive outcome of me listening to that was the suggestion I just made regarding this building. So it's amazing how the brain works when you listen to the conversation. Are there other council member comments? Catherine.
So recalling our conversation in November of last year, we also talked about whether there are locations to lease that are already existing structures. Is that still a possibility of looking at that?
If that's what the council would like us to do, we can.
I'm just thinking now with the Corte Madera chamber, their city hall having been torn down and they're leasing office space now. I just don't know if it's cost effective to do that. They determined it was more cost effective to rebuild than to continue to lease.
I'd urge caution in using the Corte Madera example because they went into that office space as temporary space.
Okay.
And they're living with conditions that aren't suitable long-term for a civic building.
All right.
So, but I'm not saying we couldn't do that. I'm just saying I'd urge caution if you walk down to their town hall, their temporary town hall and try to draw conclusions from it. Because I know from talking to their staff, they're using certain rules that let them allow certain conditions temporarily to exist. So
okay, that makes sense.
Scott?
Yeah, so my comment is I agree with the philosophy to go to the development community and get ideas, that we may like, we may not like, but I think we should do that sooner rather than later because we are on a timeline and we want to decide what we want to do with this building. So I don't see any reason to delay that. And I would be okay giving the authorization for the staff to start doing that now, including this building and next door. If there's a project, somebody can take them both and give us some ideas. And
I'd want to make sure we come back to the next meeting with the specifically written agenda items so everybody in the community knows we're having that conversation. I appreciate your trust and direction, but I want to be fair to the public that we didn't say anything like that was going to happen today.
Okay, so could we then put on the agenda for the next meeting? Because, like I said, with the timeline, I think that's inevitable. It would be silly not to get as many ideas as we can and just pick the best ones. So I would be okay just sticking it on the agenda and get that process started.
Yeah, my only cautionary tale is that it's not free for developers when they want to put proposals together. So I think they're going to wonder whether you're serious about it. So they'd have to know it's really where you want to go before they're going to invest a lot of their time and resources. So we might get some very preliminary feedback, but we might not get a robust proposal.
That's fair. I mean, I can't speak for anybody but myself, but I can't see, dropping $18 million into, making this building usable for the offices here. So I think inevitably that's one of our alternatives, one of the few alternatives we have. But again, I'm just speaking for myself. So.
Vice Mayor Paulson, did you have a comment or question?
I did. Yeah. I just wanted to follow up on what the city manager was saying. The long-term lease possibility. I think you were implying that Corte Madera didn't use. Do we have any estimates if we did go for a 10-year lease plan on the staff that's currently at City Hall, what that might look like, and how that might compare with a $5 or $8 million budget as we were talking about building a civic center?
I can certainly start working on that. I mean, I think there's two main issues to be aware of. So we could all open the paper and we could see what prevailing rates are per square foot in Larkspur to rent space. And then we have to start thinking about what our tenant improvement costs would be to operate a compliant city hall that's fully accessible. And those are the two main pools of variables we'd have to capture before we could give you that cost estimate. But we could work on that. But that second category is difficult till we know what building we're actually going to be in. And that's what I meant by the Corte Madera situation. When you occupy something temporarily, you're allowed to do some exemptions because you're in a space temporarily. They're not doing the tenant improvements. If that was gonna be their town hall forever, they'd have to spend a lot of money fixing that building up. It's not up to standards to be a civic building in perpetuity. And that's okay. We've done that too. When we moved the police temporarily into Corte Madera, when we built the current building, the situation we were in doesn't comply with every single rule, but you know that you're in it and you can give yourself that temporary exemption. You can't do that on a rolling basis because we want to try to shoehorn into some office space. So that's what part of it is. We have to go see what the prevailing rates are, and then we'd have to sort of spitball, which will make Julian really uncomfortable, what the tenant improvements of that location might be.
And that investment is left for the other property owner when the lease is over.
Assuming that investment's something the next tenant wants, yeah.
Other questions or comments, Gabe?
Yeah, sorry, one more follow-up is, I'm wondering if we've looked at, and I think we may have discussed this in brief, sort of breaking up the staff at City Hall, the public facing front office and the back office, so that, for example, I would imagine finance doesn't really need to be part of house, but you would want close to people, someone to talk to in planning. Is there any way to see what square footage we might need if we did that kind of a division between, public facing front and the back office?
I'm not following. What are you suggesting? The back office wouldn't be present? Not sure.
Correct. It wouldn't have to be, housed in the prime sort of central part, like either the Commons or Magnolia, or, it could be somewhere else without. I don't know if that's possible, or if that's a management issue where you really want people, under one roof.
Well, you still have the challenge that you may or may not be able to exempt yourself from offering accessibility to your own employees. So, and I'm not sure it's the right message as an employer to say, as a government employer to say, I want to save money by taking a portion of my staff and going and finding lease space that does or doesn't necessarily comply with contemporary standards for a civic building, because I'm not going to have them engage the public. That's maybe not the best message. So I'm willing to do that exploration. I'm not sure it's ideal though.
Okay, thank you.
Is Councilmember Haraf with us today?
Don't believe so.
Okay. Is there other council discussion? Are there other staff points of information or questions? Councilmember Kendall.
Yeah, let me just throw out to staff. I know this is on the agenda for discussion. Are you looking for us to come up with any type of specific guidelines or direction at the end of this meeting? Or is this more of a introduce to the public that this is an idea we're talking about and kind of punt everything down the road till the next meeting?
Well, my word wouldn't have been punt on this particular one.
Unveiling.
Mine would be, these are really significant decisions for the next 50 to 100 years of Larkspur. And they have complicated policy and real estate issues intertwined. And 12 years has taught me you can't rush that. And so we wanted to first remind everybody we're talking about it, and that was what we tried to do today. And so I wasn't seeking any real discussion. You're going to now start having people talk to you, which is a good thing, because that you need to hear what folks are thinking about these issues. we're going to start bringing you items so the train's moving, right? So Julian's going to start bringing you the items that say, I need to get a contract with somebody to be my construction manager. That's regardless of what we're doing. I need to get that under contract. And hopefully we'll have those grant guidelines soon so we can tell you what we can and can't do and comply with the grant. And now we're going to start to bring you, hey, remember how we said you had to think about this? Now you actually have to make a decision. And here's what, at a minimum, the decision that we need you to make. And that'll start to move us closer to launch. And so it's a bit of a luxury given this tight timetable to have done this, but I really felt it's necessary because also we have to remind everybody in the community we're having this conversation. I noticed last November, there were a lot of folks that felt like we hadn't signaled enough that we were going to start having these conversations. So part of today is to be a big, bright signal that we're getting started. And I know 3 o'clock's not our normal time, but getting the council together has been a challenge. And we've got this other big ticket thing going on during our main council meetings that I didn't feel they were necessarily the most compatible discussions to have without us staying up all night. So
thank you.
One thing I do remember, this may be what I'll check with Councilmember Hara. I think I know where he may be. He may be at a TAM executive committee meeting.
Oh, I do think you're correct.
Because at the last meeting, I asked him to start attending all the TAM meetings as the Larkspur rep. And we're on the appropriations planning and programming executive committee. So I think he's attending that 3:30 meeting today.
I think you're correct. That's right.
For those in the public who are looking for Councilmember Hara. If there's not any further council discussion, I want to thank the staff for the presentation today. Thank you, Franklin. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, the members of the public that participated. And thanks for the council discussion today. I think we're off to a good start. And with our benevolent city attorney watching over us, I feel confident that we're on solid ground. With that, we're adjourned to the regular meeting of October 19th.